it's no surprise to anybody who's a student of history when they read about the fact that conflicts, wars, help to create national identities, help to forge national integration. No matter how terrible the human losses of the civilian and military casualties, this has been a case for hundreds of years. War and the creation of new independent states has been the norm. And just look at Canada, how it celebrates 1812 as its moment of glory. Because if the Americans had won then, would there have been a Canada after that? Similarly with the US, 1776 and the American Civil War were the moments which were, particularly in the latter case, extremely bloody. 55,000 huge numbers of people who were killed, and this helped to forge the American nation. Ukraine, in that sense, is no different. The conflict and war that very few people expected to happen in 2014 was something that was brought upon Ukraine by a mixture of Viktor Yanukovych's kleptocratic presidency and his alliance with Russia's Vladimir Putin. But nevertheless, there are aspects of this conflict and war which will be seen by historians down the road as ironically quite positive. This won't mean that Ukraine will be putting up a monument to Vladimir Putin in the very near future. That's highly unlikely. In the same way as Ukrainians have never put a monument up to Joseph Stalin, who, although he was the architect of the 1930s Holodomor, the Ukrainian genocide in 1933, and the mass terror in the late 1930s, Stalin was also the Soviet leader that united Western and Eastern Ukraine. So there won't be a monument to Putin. That's certainly true. At the same time, it's worth looking at the fact to what degree there have been unintended positive consequences of Putin's aggression against Ukraine. His annexation of the Crimea and his attempt to forge some kind of so-called new Russia in eastern and southern Ukraine, which only ended up in him and his forces capturing a small section of the Donbas. The first is, of course, political. Many people watching this video will be very happy to hear that the pro-Russian camp in Ukraine disintegrated in 2014 as a consequence of 4 years of Yanukovych kleptocracy, the murders on the Euromaidan, and then Putin's aggression. So the Party of Regions and the Communist Party, which had approximately 40% of the vote, sometimes extending to 60% depending on the election law, they've gone. They're not going to come back. The Communist Party certainly won't ever come back. And the Party of Regions is finished as a political force. This was a party which was a heavy political machine that managed to secure monopoly of power in eastern and southern Ukraine. Yes, its followers, some of them have continued in the so-called opposition bloc, but they have 40 members in the Ukrainian parliament today. So they're a minuscule outfit compared to what they were in their heyday after Yushchenko's election in 2004 and under President Yanukovych. And as a consequence of that disintegration of the pro-Russian political camp, you have for the first time in Ukrainian history, well, especially since 1991, a pro-European constitutional majority, where you have over 300 deputies in the Ukrainian parliament support a pro-European course for Ukraine's foreign policy. And so the pro-Russian camp, the one that was always allegedly to be about the same size as the pro-European, that's a thing of the past. That's one of the first things we can thank Vladimir Putin for. Another factor we can thank him for is the question of national identity. What's been happening in Ukraine since the late 1980s is a slow in some parts, in other parts fast, de-Stalinization, decommunization of Ukraine, And that process never ended, really. And there were attempts under Yanukovych to kind of reverse it or to fudge it, as it were. But certainly there wasn't the re-Stalinization of what you've had in Vladimir Putin's Russia. That has expanded, and today we can see, after nearly 30 years of de-Stalinization in Ukraine, that views about the Ukrainian Holodomor, the great terror famine of the 1933, are commonplace throughout Ukraine, including in the east and south of Ukraine, which suffered the most during the famine. And even there you have large majorities who view the famine as a genocide against Ukrainians. Joseph Stalin is viewed by a majority of Ukrainians as a tyrant who committed crimes against humanity. Again, compare that to Russia, where Stalin is a big hero because he's the one who put the USSR on the map in World War II. But another surprising aspect of national identity that's come out is, for the first time ever now, a majority of Ukrainians believe that the Ukrainian nationalist forces in the 1940s, the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and their partisan army, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, were heroes, were people who deserve state recognition, state respect. This was always more controversial in the 1930s, for obvious reasons, because World War II is an emotional issue for many people, because of what the Nazis did in World War II on the Eastern Front. But today we have a majority looking favorably, for the first time, at the Ukrainian nationalist movement of the 1940s, which was a movement that fought against the Nazis and Soviets and fought for longer than most partisan armies in Europe. It fought till the early 1950s and was one of the biggest partisan movements in World War II. But more broadly, what we can say and thank Vladimir Putin for is the forging of a national identity. Ukraine, until 2013, was always perceived as being divided between Ukrainian and Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers in the West, Russian speakers in the East. That is a thing of the past now. Putin's unexpectedly, and he was very shocked and surprised by the fact that the majority of Ukraine's Russian speakers supported Kyiv during the conflict in 2014-2015. If they had not, if they had done what he expected them to do, if Ukraine's Russian speakers had supported Putin's so-called New Russia projects and his separatist projects, then Ukraine would have been very much in danger of survival as a state. And many of us were wondering what would have happened to Ukraine in the spring and summer of last year. But that wasn't the case. The majority of Ukraine's Russian speakers backed Kyiv. They didn't back Putin. So being a Russian speaker does not translate into being pro-Putin. And what that means is that you have a growth of territorial and civic identity, which is Ukrainian, that spread gradually into eastern and southern Ukraine. And if you look historically about this, what happened was that it was West Ukraine in the late 1980s that propelled Ukraine towards independence. And then by the Orange Revolution in 2004, it was Western and Central Ukraine that elected Viktor Yushchenko and that provided the shock troops for the Orange Revolution. By the Euromaidan, this had spread to eastern and southern Ukraine. And when you travel around eastern and southern Ukraine today, you will see civil society groups, staffed largely, by the way, by women, who are supporting the army, supporting the National Guard. These are people who previously were never involved in civil society activities, usually people often older, middle and older generation. And these are people who are often Russian speakers. They are doing it because they've lived all their life in Ukraine and they're Ukrainian patriots. So that aspect is something that Putin didn't expect, and it shows a shock factor to him that many of the troops fighting against the separatists and the Russian forces in the Donbas are themselves Russian speakers, including Jews, by the way, because the Jews of Ukraine supported Ukraine in this conflict. Putin would have liked them to support the separatists and support Russia, but they to a man and woman, have supported Ukraine. And there were Jewish sotny, Jewish companies of volunteers on the Euromaidan. 3 Jews died on the Euromaidan out of the 100 unarmed protesters who were killed, and there have been Jews fighting alongside Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers on the Eastern Front as well. So all of that is something that 2 years ago we may not have expected, and it's a product of the Euromaidan and the aggression against Ukraine. And this civil society movement and the way the volunteer battalions were created is an outgrowth of how Ukrainians are very, very good at self-organization. They can forage and find and beg and borrow and buy products, whether it's food, clothing, or weapons, that we in the West would find very difficult to do. And this surely must come something in the genes of Ukrainians, because after all, the Ukrainian partisan forces of the 1940s were able to fight right through to the early 1950s. And they couldn't do that without popular support and without the ability to self-organize. So that has been something that's long grown in Ukrainian identity. Another factor related to identity questions is the issue of religion, which of course is always tied strongly to national identity. And here, what's interesting is the question of how the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kyiv Patriarchate, is now the church on the rise, the church growing. It's the church which is tied to Moscow, the so-called Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is of course in decline. Is that surprising? Of course not, particularly because there are many examples of Ukrainian Orthodox, i.e. Russian Orthodox priests, helping the separatists, blessing them, and there are even cases I've read of Ukrainian prisoners of war where Russian Orthodox priests are involved in the torture against those prisoners, using crucifixes to beat them over their heads and other such things. So today, the Patriarch of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kyiv Patriarch Fіларет, is the most popular religious leader in every region of Ukraine. That would have not been the case 2 years ago. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church was always more popular in opinion polls than the Russian Orthodox Church, but the Russian Orthodox Church had more parishes in terms of numbers. But today that's changing. And if this trend continues, as it's bound to continue, then what's going to happen is that eventually there'll be a sufficient numbers of and power and influence of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kyiv Patriarch, that they will be able to be more forceful in their demands to Constantinople, i.e. Istanbul today, to the Orthodox Patriarch to insist on autocephaly, which is independence from Moscow. For Russia, this would be in many ways as big a shock as if they had lost World War II, because the Russian Orthodox Church doesn't just lay claim to territory within Russia, it lays claim to holding on to a church throughout the Eastern Slavic world. And there are as many Orthodox parishes in Ukraine as there are in Russia, even though Ukraine has a population 3 times smaller than Russia. So if the Russian Orthodox Church was to lose Ukraine, then it would be very much downgraded in the world hierarchy of influential Orthodox churches. So the Orthodox Church isn't just a question of religion, even of national identity. There is a geopolitical factor involved as well. Another factor which is influenced by the war is the question of foreign policy. For the first time ever now, we have a majority of Ukrainians who support membership of NATO. That was never the case. There was always a majority in support of EU membership, because that wasn't controversial. Supporting membership of the European Union wasn't really a controversial issue, because it's recognized as a kind of an institution that promotes democracy, human rights, market economy, and such like, and it's not an institution that really has geopolitical objectives. But NATO was always seen as something negative by a large number of Ukrainians, and particularly, of course, Russians. where you have a xenophobically anti-Western, anti-American campaign going on for at least the last decade. In Ukraine, you had, up till the Kuchma era, up till 2004, you had about 1/3 in favor of membership, 1/3 opposed, and 1/3 indifferent. That deteriorated against NATO membership under Yanukovych because he was basically supporting the Russian line that Ukraine shouldn't join NATO. That's all changed. Now we have a majority of Ukrainians in support of NATO membership, close to 50%, which means that in a referendum it would be higher than 50%, and a minority opposed to NATO membership. That is a major change in Ukrainian foreign policy. Also added to that is a massive decline and collapse in support of integration with Russia and with the CIS. Up until 2013, you had at least about 30%, maybe sometimes higher, support for amongst Ukrainians for integration into Putin's CIS customs union, which was meant to evolve into a Eurasian union. That's gone. Now we're talking about anything between 10 and 15% still back that, which is a minuscule amount of people compared to EU and NATO membership support. So that has also changed. And what's changed as well is, related to that, is that Vladimir Putin is the most negatively viewed foreign leader in Ukraine today. He has negative ratings in Ukraine of something in the region of 75%. Nobody is detested as much as Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. Ukrainians also detest the Russian government. Similar figures of around 70+% of Ukrainians who think negatively of the Russian government. What's interesting is that far, far fewer, only something like 15% of Ukrainians have negative views of Russians living in Russia. So that shows that this is, Ukrainians are very mature politically in that they can differentiate between the population and the actions of the government and the president. And that shows more a growth of patriotism as opposed to some kind of crazy nationalism. And that's a good sign in Ukraine. And that in turn is reflected in the fact that far-right nationalist groups like Svoboda and Right Sector were not given large numbers of votes in the presidential and parliamentary elections last year. So we've had the growth of civic nationalism, which is also another term for patriotism or territorial nationalism. And so, ironic as it may seem, Putin has done a lot of things for Ukraine. He's also, by the way, forced the Ukrainian authorities, for the first time ever since 1991, to be serious about investing in their security forces. I mean, the Ukrainian military was a joke, even under Yushchenko, never mind under Yanukovych when it was, downgraded completely. Because of the war, this is the first time ever that Ukraine is investing serious amounts of money, and both in terms of infrastructure, weaponry, manpower, into the Ukrainian military. Training from the West, there are something like 7 or 8 countries, Western countries, which are now training Ukrainian forces, including Canada, America, Britain, Poland, Turkey, Israel, Georgia, and Lithuania, all training Ukrainian forces now. So far more than in the Yushchenko era, when NATO did have a program of training with Ukraine, and including Canada, that's expanded. So Ukraine is investing in its military. The Western governments, particularly the United States, are investing in transforming Ukraine's police into Ukraine's militia, into a police force, into a Western police force, including creating a new SWAT, Special Forces Police Unit, which will replace the Berkut, which was disbanded last year because they were the ones who murdered the protesters. So the conflict is actually, besides foreign policy, is helping to transform Ukraine's military and police forces. And so, in that sense, if Putin was unable to defeat Ukraine in 2014, when the Ukraine state was either absent or weak, and what defeated Putin was a people's war of basically volunteer battalions and civil society, which grew out of the Euromaidan, then today, when the state is stronger, when there's been more investment in institutions, when the volunteer battalions have been absorbed by the military, by the National Guard, or by the security service of Ukraine, then the threat of Putin devouring Ukraine or dismantling Ukraine is far, far less. So, ironic as it may seem, and of course the tragic side of this is that it cost so many civilian lives, 8,000 civilian lives according to the United Nations, a lot of destruction of property, and an untoward large number of Ukrainian military losses, maybe something in the region of 3,000 or so. But this was a war that Ukraine didn't decide to fight. It was a war brought onto Ukraine. But as a consequence of that war, there will be many, many positive developments in Ukraine taking place. And in the run of things, historians will tell you, this is not surprising, because this happens throughout history. And many countries have emerged and their national identities have been forged by conflict and war. And in this case, Ukraine is no different.